Good morning, colleagues, friends of the University of the West Indies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning session where we're looking at the implications of the United States elections on the future of the Caribbean. It is my pleasure to welcome you this morning. My name is Natalie Dietrich Jones. I am Research Fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion and I do the preliminary introduction of our speakers, I'm just going to hand over to Professor Lloyd Waller, who will bring greetings on behalf of SALISES. Over to you, Prof. Waller.
Thank you very much, Natalie. As the director of SALISES, I extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us today on this critical webinar, Beyond Borders, the U.S. elections and its implications for the future of the Caribbean. This event, for me, comes at a pivotal moment, days before the world's greatest superpower, located in close proximity to the Caribbean, undertakes a general election. A superpower which many of us would say once it sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold. Indeed, this election will have far-reaching implications for the Caribbean as it relates to shifts in foreign policy, economic impact and trade, immigration policies, tourism, climate policy and environmental impacts, security and crime management, diaspora engagement, investment, trade, aid, geopolitical influences, social and cultural dynamics, you name it. We, however, are privileged today to have an esteemed panel of experts who will bring a diverse perspective on these particular issues, some of which are areas of research and teaching that I myself have benefited from, specifically as it relates to Professor Byron, who was my lecturer for international relations, who gave me some broad insights into the implications of the U.S. elections in the Caribbean. And Prof. Byron, I do remember that particular lecture. This webinar for us underscores SALISES' commitment to advancing research and fostering dialogue on issues that we believe deeply impact the Caribbean. And so I thank you for joining us today as we navigate this critical issue and have this particular discussion. And I now invite one of our senior research fellows, Natalie Dietrich Jones, whose area of research is migration studies, another area that will have significant implications for us in the Caribbean based on the outcomes of that specific election. As you know, there are two different views regarding migration, and who knows, we may see an outcome that may favor one side or the other side. Either way, it will have significant implications for the Caribbean. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Natalie, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Waller. And you've already given us a good head start on the discussion, a reminder about the prominence of the U.S. and the implications for us being defined as their third border. This morning, however, we're going to test a commonly held perspective about the unimportance of the region to the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy by dissecting the implications of a Democratic or Republican win for the Caribbean. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, but before I do that, I would just like to share with our guests that our chat function will be enabled after the presentations have occurred, so in the second half of the program. So all your burning questions can be posed during that segment, and you can send those questions directly to me in the chat. So I'm going to introduce our guests in the order in which they will present. So I'm going to start with Professor Byron. You can get your presentation ready in the meantime. Professor Jessica Byron was director of the University of the West Indies Institute of International Relations at the UWI St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago from August 2016 until August 2022. As part of the functions associated with this post, she oversaw the operations of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, which is part of the IIR. and she's currently appointed as Honorary Professor, SALISES MONA, and also a member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, a group of professionals that engages in research and policy advocacy on U.S. Caribbean relations. Professor Byron is perhaps one of our eminent experts, and we look forward to her contribution to this discussion. Dr. Jeffrey Bosworth earned his PhD in political science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and is currently an associate professor at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania at the Mansfield campus. He's chair of the Department of History, Philosophy, and Political Science. His research is broadly aimed at democracy and development in the Caribbean with a special focus on belief. He investigates the complex interplay of political parties, elections, and electoral laws, and the role they play in shaping overall democratic institutions and practices. And we look forward to hearing his perspective on how the machinations of the elections themselves might have a bearing on the future relations with the Caribbean. We're pleased to have Mea Boykins with us. She's one of our graduate students, postgraduate students, who is currently undertaking a PhD in governance and public policy at SALISES MONA, where she's exploring the African American female judiciary and the political challenges that they encounter. She's a seasoned business development professional, award-winning humanitarian, and speaker who specializes in forging global partnerships and events that drive social and economic progress. Her initiatives encompass humanitarian aid, workforce development, small business growth, and college scholarship programs across the US, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, Asia, and beyond. So quite a breadth of experience, and she will speak based on her lived experience as a diasporan or generation of diasporan in the US, and also her view on the gendered implications of the election. And last but not least, we have Dr. Emanuel Patrick Quashie, who is a lecturer in the Department of Government at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He has over 8 years experience as a qualitative researcher and teaches a variety of courses in international relations, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Dr. Quashie's research focuses on international terrorism, specifically on the stakeholders of terrorism, as well as terrorism-related matters within the Caribbean context. And he's the author of one book, The Stakeholders of Terrorism and the Caribbean, and is currently working on another book, The War on Terror and the Caribbean. So quite an interesting focus for the region, and there's been a lot at stake in the last decade on this specific area, and we look forward to hearing Dr. Quashie's perspectives. So just before we hand over to Prof. Byron, just a reminder, you have 10 minutes to deliver your talk, and your presentation will be followed by a brief engagement. So handing over now to Prof. Byron.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dietrich Jones. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. What I'm going to do is to simply raise some of the areas of engagement between the Caribbean and the US that I think will be crucial for us as we go into the next presidency. I won't have time to answer all the questions, but I'm sure that in the extensive debate that we have, some of those can be answered. So, okay, my area is international relations, and very often we start by looking at things on the global level and on the regional level, and of course on the bilateral level. So I'm going to follow that format. Less bilateral, but certainly regional, with some mention of interests of specific countries. And I would like to just briefly pay homage to our late Professor Richard Bernal, Ambassador Richard Bernal, who I remember when we were approaching the end of the Trump, we were discussing the post-Trump electoral term, presidential term. And there were two things that he did during those times. He wrote an excellent policy brief on US-Caribbean relations after the Strategic Engagement Act with the Caribbean was passed. That would have been around 2017. And I remember him also emphasizing the fact that in 2020, the United States had so many domestic issues and challenges to face that we should not raise our expectations too much about what their foreign policy was going to be like, that their major focus was going to be on addressing domestic challenges. And I think that was very wise. That was a very wise prediction. Okay, on the global side, I think that the post-electoral US foreign policy is frozen in the prism of China-US strategic competition. That is the first thing we have to remember. And there are many aspects of global politics and economics which will be viewed through that lens, no matter who becomes the next president of the United States. There may be significant nuances in the approaches that are espoused by each candidate, but the main agenda is going to be that strategic competition. If we have a future President Trump, the policy will be much more combative and will be focused on economic transactions. If we have a future President Harris, it will be broader based, but still combative and competitive in terms of the engagement with China and in terms of looking at the engagement of our countries, for example, with China. This has major implications for the Caribbean because Caribbean countries many have strong relations of economic, sociocultural, and political cooperation with China, and others have with Taiwan. Both groups will experience strong ripple effects of the post-electoral shifts of either a Republican or a Democratic presidential candidate concerning China policy and its repercussions in different parts of the world. The Caribbean is seen by the United States as its closest zone of geopolitical influence. Many Caribbean and Central American and Latin American countries have, in the last few years, experienced US pressure concerning their economic and political relations with China. I can think of Panama and Jamaica as two cases in point, particularly during the last Trump administration. Another manifestation has been US Biden administration's moves to bump up its diplomatic and security presence in the Eastern Caribbean in order to counteract what they have seen as growing Chinese diplomatic influence on the other side of the pond, the Caribbean pond, from where you are located. Caribbean countries will be challenged in their efforts to maintain their own strategic balance and their own collaborative relations with both of these powers, and to advance their agendas of small island developing states' development interests and global order interests of the global South, of which we are a part. Another area of concern at the global level will be the multilateral system, which is teetering on its legs at the moment, and multilateralism, something that Caribbean countries regard as being very much in their interest to maintain. It seems already that the United Nations is extremely challenged and lacking in resources. It's being besieged by global conflicts, by major conflicts in, the Middle East, Sudan, Ukraine, Russia, etc. And equally, other organizations, for example, the World Trade Organization, faces growing challenges to maintain support and participation in the global trade normative system. But multilateralism is very important for the Caribbean, particularly for CARICOM countries. And the challenge will be, what role can we play in preserving and constructively reshaping this system so that it continues to buttress development, well-being, peace and security as far as possible for members of the international community. Trump is likely to significantly reduce US funding for multilateral institutions if we read the signs based on his last presidency. Whereas in the case of a Harris administration, there would be support for multilateralism, but multilateralism that would support a central role for the United States, of course. Third area of major global interest for the Caribbean is climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. A major challenge and an existential threat area for the Caribbean. The Caribbean is at odds with both candidates' prospective approaches on this, but much more so in the case of a Trump win. The Caribbean itself has cross-cutting interests on climate change action. Some countries have very strong interests in and partnerships with US fossil fuels development industries. Other countries are seeking funding and technological support to shift not merely to clean energy, which in US speak means natural gas, but to greater development of renewable energy sources. And the fourth area is that of global trade. I think you can all remember the tariff war between the United States and China during the last Trump presidency, and the major disruption that this caused to the entire global trading system, the supply problems, the price changes, and that would be of significant concern for Caribbean countries. Much of our supplies come from the United States. But also we are very dependent on supply flows from the Pacific and from China. Now, at the regional level, what are US positions vis-a-vis Latin America and the Caribbean likely to be? And what would be major Caribbean concerns? Well, what would be the United States support for regionalism? Regionalism is a major plank of, well, whether symbolic or real, for most countries in CARICOM. Now, during the last Trump presidency, he had a very disturbing record in this respect. Caribbean leaders and countries were cherry-picked to meet with and to do business with. There was scant attention paid to regional structures and practices. There was also considerable manipulation of the OAS, particularly in relation to the questions relating to Venezuela. A Harris presidency would be more positive in supporting regionalism, as on other scores, but I think we should be measured in our expectations. In her case, there would be some continuity with Biden initiatives, particularly in the major area for engagement being the Partnership for the Americas, which was launched in 2022, got off to a slow start, but we began to see the emerging contours of what it might look like by 2023. Only two Caribbean countries, our Caribbean countries, feature in that so far, Barbados and the Dominican Republic. But there is a focus on building private sector competitiveness, having an investment platform for sustainable infrastructure, building a digital workforce, and investment in climate financing solutions, all of which are of interest to the Caribbean in one form or another. There's also the question, major question for the Caribbean about migration. No, I'm not going to say much about that. There are others here who know much more than I do about the question of migration, but it is significant that the Biden-Harris administration struck deals with a number of Latin American countries, such as Mexico, such as, I don't know if it was Colombia, another major northern Latin American countries, to host migrants from the Central American region in order to protect US borders. One can expect this to continue collaboratively, if possible, if there is a Harris presidency, and using much tougher and rougher tactics if we have a Trump presidency. Among the most disturbing regional scenarios for Caribbean and CARICOM are the outlooks for Cuba and Haiti in the coming presidential term. Trump's administrative policies for Cuba during his last term were disastrous. Cuba was put on the list of terrorism states quite unfairly, and Part 3 of the Helms-Burton law was initiated for the first time. So there were cases in the US courts on people who had bought Cuban property, etc. The Biden-Harris Cuba policies have been disappointing. They were slow to get off the ground. They have done too little, too late, and they are partly responsible for the massive outflow of Cuban citizens, over 1 million over the past 5 years, and the continued economic decline of Cuba. This is a crucial area for Caribbean scenario development and the preparing of strategic plans, because we may have a second Trump presidency, and we do not yet know how a Harris presidency would improve and make up for lost time. It is not in the Caribbean interest to have Cuba continue to decline and be depopulated, both for reasons of solidarity and goodwill, and also for regional stability and well-being. Cuba and its people are a tremendous asset for our Caribbean region. Haiti also is a very vulnerable case. The Caribbean, well, certainly doesn't seem to think that it has many options within the country, but it supports multilateral initiatives, and the Caribbean continues to provide advice and support as far as possible to the interim Haitian government. And Haiti, of course, is a member of CARICOM. We can possibly expect and should prepare to host many more of our Haitian brothers and sisters as a new migration policy develops in the United States. What I can say is, for the Haitian communities that I am aware of in the Eastern Caribbean, they are making a solid contribution in the countries where they are located and are a positive element. Now, subregional and bilateral issues. I think that the United States during the present ending administration, has been in constant and constructive dialogue with the OECS countries that have citizenship by investment policies. That is one area that will continue to be a major issue area bilaterally and subregionally. Security cooperation, the future of CBERA and CBTPA, the trade agreements and other regional trade agreements, and US gun laws and the impact on our crime scene of a continued flow of United States weapons into our countries, and the lack of much real action by the United States. There is an interest in continuing to facilitate our intermestic relations. There's two-way migratory flows between the US and the Caribbean. Most of us have large numbers of US citizens who are permanent residents, partial residents in our countries. All of this is good, and it's important to facilitate and enhance our sociocultural and economic flows of people and goods and investment and ideas. and also to cooperate on disaster and emergency management. And finally, I say this especially in light of what happened, the remarks made concerning Puerto Rico at a recent Trump rally. Countries, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean, have a very strong interest in continuing and in having closer cooperation with the U.S. Virgin Island territories and with Puerto Rico. So I'll stop there, and then in the discussion, we can go more into all of this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Byron. Wide-ranging and yet still very deep. I had wanted us to probe a little bit what you first started with in terms of this prism of China, because some people say that it's only with the ascendance of China in the region that the US has returned to the Caribbean. But I'll ask you to hold that thought, because I'm going to hand over to Dr. Bosworth and allow him to speak. And in the wider Q&A, then we'll come back to this point. Dr. Bosworth?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all today. My name is Jeff Bosworth, and I'm a political scientist at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a comparativist by nature with a strong interest in the Caribbean overall and Belize most specifically. But my other professional side is U.S. politics. I teach courses on U.S. politics, the U.S. presidency, and I'm even teaching a mini course right now on the 2024 election. And I kind of regarded my goal and my role here is to provide a bit of a U.S.-centric perspective to the issues with U.S. Caribbean and potential different outcomes to the election next week. My overall plan here is to outline a few ideas about how a Harris or a Trump presidency might approach U.S. Caribbean issues. And in part, the two candidates are really quite different in their perspectives and likely approaches. On the other hand, there's some rather significant commonalities as well. And I'll start by providing a little bit of an overview of each candidate to highlight the key differences, and then turn to some of the things they have in common. And then towards the end, I'll briefly address a few broad issues in the U.S.-Caribbean relationship, most specifically immigration, security, and trade. So very, very broad issues, I guess. One difference between the two candidates is their background. Harris has Jamaican heritage from her father's side, and it may be the case that that helps make her a little bit more sensitive to issues that impact the Caribbean. However, I think it's unlikely that this makes much of a difference. She's not going to spend a lot of extra time on the Caribbean for this reason. She's going to be driven by the key challenges faced by the U.S., and quite frankly, the Caribbean is not going to be a big priority for her administration. Trump has no special connection to the region, and his background is, rich white guy, real estate billionaire. He's even less likely to focus any particular special emphasis on the region, and he tends to be more transactional in his approaches to things. I think a second key difference is just the issues that each would emphasize. From the Harris perspective, she'd be more likely to highlight things like strengthening democracy, curbing instability, protecting human rights, addressing climate change, sustainable development. Those at least would be higher priorities than perhaps other issues within the relationship. But Trump, in contrast, would largely ignore climate change. He sort of famously doesn't seem to believe that it's happening or think that it's a threat if it does. And he would have a much greater emphasis on issues related to immigration and trade. I think the third key difference is their overall approaches to foreign policy that each of them would be likely to undertake. Professor Byron touched, I think, on some of those. I think the key one is the multilateral versus bilateral kind of approach. Harris's instinct seems to be to work more in a cooperative and multilateral kind of fashion with leaders of the region, a little bit more collectively. She would take the view that U.S. interests are best protected by working through broader coalitions to tackle difficult problems. In rather sharp contrast, Trump would take a much more bilateral approach, and he would work on issues with individual countries. But moreover, his lens would be through this America First policy, in which he tends to see every issue as a bilateral negotiation between the U.S. and any other country, where the U.S. is the far stronger partner and can exact far more favorable terms for the U.S. Relative to smaller countries. Related to this is that Harris would be far more likely to rely on career diplomats and perhaps increase, to some extent, or at least maintain, the U.S. diplomatic presence in the Caribbean. Trump is really attracted to the idea that as president, he alone decides matters of foreign policy. He sees less value in a strong diplomatic corps. He kind of thinks he can do it himself through Twitter or X these days. He would be more likely to order diplomats to do things rather than listen to what diplomats say should be done. He doesn't like experts. He doesn't like to read. He doesn't like to take advice. He thinks he can kind of divine the correct path through whatever inspiration he feels he gets. So the key differences, I think, would be their backgrounds, the issues they would emphasize, and the strategies for protecting U.S. interests, primarily as multilateral versus bilateral approach. But there's commonalities as well. While both might highlight different aspects of the issues, both are going to be broadly concerned with trade, security, and immigration. Both are going to be concerned about the rising influence of China in the region. I do think there's something to the idea that the U.S. pays a little more attention to the Caribbean these days because China has paid more attention to the Caribbean as well. Both are going to recognize the drug trade, for example, as a problem. Both are going to have to address issues of immigration, obviously in very different ways, but it's an issue for both of them. And in this sense, you could argue that the issues are the issues, and the U.S. has certain interests, and no matter who's president, they're going to need to be addressed. So there's some common ground in terms of the context. Another similarity is that both are going to be highly constrained by domestic policy concerns. I think most specifically the very large U.S. deficit and mounting debt. Neither candidate is really running on a platform of balanced budget or tackling the massive debt that the U.S. has taken, but either one is going to have to deal with it if elected. And this primarily means that there's no new major spending is going to be likely, and certainly no increase in foreign aid for development. This lack of available funds is going to limit U.S. engagement. Between the two, Trump is much more likely to look for reductions in foreign aid. But Harris isn't even going to look to increase it. At best, I would say she'd look to maintain it, and she might get away with some small increases on specific issues here and there. But in that regard, there wouldn't be much difference between the two of them. And while neither candidate is campaigning with this, it's going to be something they have to deal with. No matter how you look at it, the Caribbean is unlikely to see any significant increase and more likely to see some kind of decrease in U.S. government spending in the region in general. In sum, the next U.S. president is going to be primarily focused on domestic issues, not Caribbean issues. To turn to a few of these sort of more specific issues, let me just start with immigration, right? This is, again, it's an issue for both candidates, but their approaches and goals are quite different. Harris, I think, will tend to look to expand and address the root causes of immigration from the Caribbean to the U.S., and she would be more likely to take this multilateral approach to the problem. Her goal is going to be to reduce immigration pressures, particularly the so-called illegal immigration to the U.S. For his part, Trump has really made immigration, both legal and illegal, a key part of his former presidency and a key part of his campaign in 2020 and again this year with 2024. In many ways, I would say he single-handedly put immigration as a high priority issue for Americans, not just his supporters, but all Americans to some extent. And his goal is more reducing both types, legal and illegal. He stated his support for a large-scale deportation program of undocumented migrants. And if he does this, Caribbean countries may witness a significant influx of people who currently live in the U.S. who are forced to return to where they're from. And on the legal side, he's voiced support for reductions in the overall numbers allowed to the U.S. So immigrating to the U.S., as hard as it currently is, may get more difficult under a Trump administration. But I think the important point to make here is that over the last decade or so, the U.S. has become overall less welcoming to immigration. Harris may not want to reduce it, but she's going to be forced to enforce greater border security. She's going to be forced to try to reduce undocumented migrants. And while she wouldn't be in favor of cutting legal immigration, she's also not going to make it easier nor expand it. And the prospect of any major immigration reform via Congress is highly unlikely, I think, from either Harris or Trump. Trump would be more likely to use executive orders and rule changes to get what he wants, but some of this is going to depend on which party controls the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. If Trump were to win with party control, he would be more likely to take a just policy through creating new bills, new policies with Congress. If he doesn't have control of one of those houses, he'll look to do it anyway. Harris would likewise be limited if Republicans controlled one or more chambers of the U.S. legislature. I think in terms of security, with Harris, climate change to her would be a greater issue. She would take this more multilateral approach. She'd be more likely to see an issue like Haiti as something that maybe the U.S. and the region need to address from the sort of root causes perspectives. But the firearms and drug trade is going to be important for her too. And Harris might be more willing to ease some restrictions on Cuba. And I think she'd be far less interested in promoting regime change in Venezuela, right? Trump, there would be a much greater emphasis on, say, drug trafficking and less emphasis on climate change. And he's more likely to beef up the U.S. role in terms of law enforcement and interdiction. His strategy would be to get Caribbean governments to play more of a leading role in curbing this drug trade destined for the U.S. market. And he would do this more in a bilateral and to some extent even unilateral approach. His concern would be finding ways to, in his view, improve the U.S. position. How does the U.S. get more out of a relationship like this? I think, for example, on Haiti, Trump's not even going to acknowledge that it's a problem, at least not for him. He's not going to see an upside in getting involved, and he probably, in some ways, he may undermine attempts to stabilize the situation. And I think he would certainly take a harder line on Cuba and Venezuela as he did in his first administration. This is probably not a strategy that would be welcomed by the Caribbean. And then last on trade, the big aspect to this is the tariff policy that Trump has been putting forward. On the one hand, he's looking at a tariff on all imports to the U.S., and that's going to negatively impact Caribbean exports to the U.S. But then additional emphasis he's put on additional tariffs on China and some on Mexico. Even in his own party, there's people that, the Republican Party has traditionally been free trade. The Republican Party supported NAFTA, years ago. So this is a bit of a shift for them. But he does seem to have changed some minds in the Republican Party through his control of it. and his followers kind of seem to go after this. Of course, my primary concern is whether or not I can still buy Red Stripe in my local grocery store at a reasonable price. So with Harris, the chances of that are greater. And with Trump, the chances are I'll have to pay more if I can get it at all. But again, I think you'll get greater engagement and cooperation from Harris. As I said, her instinct is more multilateral. And climate change, clean energy, sustainable development, these would be the aspects of a trade relationship she would highlight. Trump would probably provide less overall engagement or cooperation, but when he does, it would be bilateral. It'll be this America First kind of lens. And he's going to look at each Caribbean country as how can the U.S. improve its position over each of those countries to get what he will consider a better deal. It's not so likely to address climate change and far more likely to look at issues of trade. For a lot of Caribbean countries, they import a fair amount from the U.S. He may look to expand that, particularly in areas like energy. But he's going to look for how can he help U.S. exports to the Caribbean through bilateral deals. But again, both of them on trade are going to be limited. There's not going to be a lot of money for development aid or things like that. So I think to some extent, the Caribbean needs to be prepared either way to be a little bit more on its own than maybe it has been in the past. Although I'd argue in many ways, U.S. has kind of ignored the Caribbean for the bulk of its history, aside from periodic interest through crises. But let me just stop there and sort of leave you with some ideas, and we can pick some things up in discussion.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Bosworth. I see maybe some commonalities between your presentation and Professor Byron's, but there was something that you raised that I did wanted to ask for clarity for our viewers who may not necessarily understand just how the internal politics works. So maybe very quickly in a minute, if you can, this relationship that you highlighted in terms of how Senate and House of Representatives work, because the president is one element, but then he has to work in concert with these two machines. So could you explain why that's important, having a Republican-controlled Senate and House of Representatives for Trump and the reverse for Harris?
Okay. In the U.S. system, major change, like through basic legislation, we have often a divided system in that in order to make major change, passing bills, you need a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the president to support. So when the same party has majorities in the House and the Senate and the presidency, we're more likely to see major change. Obamacare was passed when Democrats had control of the House, Senate, and the presidency. In absence of that, it would have been very difficult to do. So there's some interest. And in fact, I think in the House, Republicans probably have the edge going into the election. I think they have the edge in the Senate as well, but it's going to be close either way. So if Trump is facing majorities in the House and Senate, it will be more attractive to him to enact more permanent changes to things like immigration policy by going through bills. If he faces a democratically controlled House or Senate, he can still do quite a bit through rule changes and executive orders. And presidents typically do that. If they can get stuff through Congress, they're more likely to go that route. And if they can't, they can act on a more limited basis, but they can act on their own to effect some changes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. We're gonna move to Dr. Quashie, who I think is gonna focus on the security dimensions. So over to you, Emanuel.
Sorry, my mic wasn't on when I said thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jones, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to just share a slide. It's not going to be that long. I will keep within the 10 minutes mark or even less. So I will try my best, but I'm trying to see how I would share the screen. Okay, share it quickly. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, I can see,
Okay.
but you may need to go to slideshow.
Oh, yes, right. Okay, so this might be better, right? All right, so don't mind the amount of words. I'm not going to be reading them. This is just really for information for the audience, just in case those wanted to read a little bit while I speak. So yes, so my focus is going to be on the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And I also wanted to look also at international terrorism as well. But I will look at that more when we get to the discussion part. But I just wanted to examine the Caribbean Basin Initiative a little bit. And the reason why it is because it's an important pillar of US Caribbean relations. Both Professor Byron and Dr. Bosworth also, I think in one way or the other, had mentioned trade and also the CBI as well. But it's an area that I have done some research on, and I have also written an article on it for those who might want the extra reading as well. Dr. Bosworth also talked about the possibility of a Trump presidency who might impose tariffs. And this is where the CBI comes in as well, because the Caribbean Basin Initiative also provides duty-free access on a range of goods for Caribbean Basin states into the United States. Some of these goods range from nuts, coffee, fish, and also edible fruits, among others as well. The apparel, however, was the one that seems to have been the largest US imports out of all of the other goods. They amounted to approximately 48%, roughly 8.2 billion in 1998. Apparel is also a very important part of the rules of origin of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, so much so that there were also amendments to the rules for Haiti, seeing that Haiti is also a critical part of this discussion as well. And that amendment was also done through the Hope and also Help Act as well. And what it really means is that Haiti was allowed to have portion of its value-added commodity and apparel assessed within Haiti or any CBI state or even the United States as well, which is different from the other Caribbean Basin states that were benefiting from the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Agreement, which is also abbreviated as CBTPA. Just a quick glance of the CBI to kind of stress and emphasize its significance to the region. In 2022, CBI Basin states, or I should say CBI countries, or those who benefit from it, amounted to 11.6 billion US import, ranking 26 among US import suppliers for that year, which is a major jump from previous years. And to put this into perspective, we will see in 2020, that amount was 8.7 billion, and also the year after, and also the year before, that amount was also roughly 5.7 or so billion. And again, some of the stuff is on the slide, so I want to really read all of it. But I will leave it with the presenters, and so that way others can also access it. An important part of also the CBI is also known as the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And this was also implemented during the Obama administration as well. So this is also a very important facet of the CBI because it deals with security-related matters such as cybercrime and also illicit drug trafficking as well, and terrorism, among others. The unilateral nature and also the uncertainty that comes with the CBI is also an issue as well. And the reason why it is because the president is the one that decides on the way the CBI, or even in terms of the agenda of the CBI as well. And I think this is also an important point to clarify, given the difference that Dr. Bosworth also recently explained in terms of how the executive branch and also the legislative branch also work in concert with each other, and so on. So how would the CBI look within the context of the US presidential election? So what I decided to do is to, kind of jump ahead just a little bit, and using 538, which also uses a combination of data, which includes polling, economics, and demographic as well, to explore the possible outcome of the presidential election. And they have scored Donald Trump 54 out of 100 chance of winning the presidency. And they have scored Kamala 45 out of 100 chance of clinching the presidential election. So obviously the race is still tight, but based on that poll, it is more likely to go to a Trump rather than Harris. But then again, this is just a polls, and polls are just prediction based on limited data as well, and so on. But I wanted to put that into context as well, because during the Trump, if Trump wins, we are more likely to see less funding for the Caribbean Basin Initiative. We are not going to see any major or even minor amendments as it relates to any sort of tangible changes for the CBI, unless, of course, it benefits the United States. And I think the two previous presenter also touched on the fact that Trump is more of a transactional type of president, so he is more likely to ensure that the CBI, if he does any change, benefits the United States more. On the other hand, if Kamala Harris win, and using the Biden administration as a unit of analysis, given that she's the VP of that administration as well, you are going to see a continued support for the CBI as it currently is, with very little amendments as well. You're not going to see really much change, but she's less likely to reduce funding for the CBI. She is more likely to just sort of maintain the funding for the CBI if any change, she might just slightly reduce it, but not as much as in the case of Trump, who I feel is more likely to reduce quite a lot of it. And also during his administration as well, he didn't really focus much on it. To conclude on the CBI and so on, and some of the recommendations which I would like to propose for either president, that's if they listen, of course, is to change some of the rules of origin and also change the unilateral nature. That also comes with the CBI. And the reason why is because you are more likely to get CBI-related investments if some of those are also amended as well. OECD states are more service-oriented economies. And if we could include some services within the CBI, that will also benefit the small island developing states of the Eastern Caribbean. Also, I would like to see a lot more intelligence gathering and giving my specific area as well as it relates to combating terrorism within the region. And I know it's also an issue for the United States, because even during the Trump presidency as well, I think it was John Kelly had also stressed the concern as it relates to potential foreign terrorist fighters who might be returning to the region as well. And that was a major issue. So I think if we have a lot more deep intelligence gathering and also sharing with the United States as part of the CBSI, we are more likely to effectively, efficaciously combat terrorism-related issues as well. So I will conclude there. As I said, it was going to be very short, not to take up too much time. But of course, we can continue the discussion as we go over to the question portion of this event as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Quashie. So maybe just one follow-up question, because I see that you propose, I guess, a fairly consistent approach across the administrations in terms of how CBI would be managed.
Yes.
So I'm going to flip the question to the region to say, or to ask, how should we then engage the US, our primary trading partner, on the matter of trade, depending on who takes power? And it was mentioned earlier that Trump has not a very cohesive approach to engaging with the region. I'm just going to read something if I can find it quickly. This is Ronald Sanders. He says that Trump's administration has failed to elaborate and roll out a specific Caribbean policy, and he has certainly not attempted to consult with the Caribbean leadership on what such a policy would look like. So how should the region engage with either president, given this difference in strategic approach to foreign policy, but with a focus on trade, since that's what you...
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a very good question as well to raise. And I think the only option that the region has is to use the rules-based system that was also created by the United States. And on that point, you mentioned a statement by Ambassador Ronald Sanders as well. And I think he will also agree with me on this point, given that Antigua as well had also carried the United States to the case to the WTO on the gambling issue. And they have also won that case. But the United States have yet to also adhere to the ruling of the WTO. So I think one of the things that the region can do is use the rules-based system that is in place. But the issue is if the United States is going to act in good faith in terms of adhering to the rules or to the ruling, and so on, so on, so on. Another way in which the region is to do it collectively. And I think this is also an issue as well. And I think it was Professor Byron who also noted this in her presentation as well, when she said that you also had some leaders from the region meeting with Donald Trump. And I remember that was an issue because some did not meet with him, but also some met with him at his Mar-a-Lago hotel. So what we need to do is we need to also take a collective approach, and we need to speak with one voice as well. We can't have some meeting with either Trump or Harris and others don't. We have to put a united front in order for us to ensure that we get the best out of any of the trade related engagements or agreements that we have with the United States.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Quashie. We're gonna hand over to Mea Boykins, who will do the last intervention. Are you ready, Mea?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I've greatly enjoyed the conversation thus far with my colleagues here on the panel. So just to share a bit about my background, my journey in government began in 2016 with campaign work across Congress, Senate, mayoral campaigns, city council, and judicial races. Over time, I took on roles in canvassing and phone banking for Democrats nationwide. I identify as a Democrat as well, so notably with the Democrats of Georgia. I've also worked alongside Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, who later became President Biden's senior advisor, gaining experience in diplomatic protocol, handling international leaders, and advising on policy. Currently, I work with the Georgia House of Representatives as Director of Partnerships and External Engagement. Here, I research and draft policies across health, climate, and business. Having spent the past 5 years living and studying in Jamaica, I bring a unique perspective on U.S. elections and their impact on the Caribbean and Latin America. Today, I'll discuss how pivotal this election is, where 435 House seats and 33 Senate seats are open, might influence the region. I'll also address gender policy differences between candidates and their impacts on the U.S. judiciary, which profoundly affects public trust and judicial outcomes. So regarding the impact on Latin America and the Caribbean, U.S. leadership changes have profound implications for the Caribbean and Latin America, especially concerning trade, foreign policy, and immigration. Currently, diplomacy with major countries like Brazil and Mexico is complex, and a challenging relationship with Venezuela. Former President Trump's approach emphasizes assertive trade policies, which may slow economic growth, especially in Mexico and Central America. His administration's immigration policies, framed around border security, often overlook nuanced regional needs, potentially impacting the flow of migrants and critical resources for countries in the hemisphere. Former President Trump's trade policies pose significant downside risks for the region. A Harris administration would likely bring continuity to the Biden administration's focus on stable, constructive relationships with these nations. We would expect a Harris presidency to renew and uphold the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, benefiting business climates and promoting transparency regarding trade across the region. Harris would likely continue fostering strong regional ties with a focus on climate action, sustainable development, and security in the Caribbean. Her connection to the Caribbean, with her father being Jamaican, also lend hope that she might have a uniquely vested interest in enhancing U.S.-Caribbean relations, with promises for development in financing renewable energy and education. Regarding gender policies and health. So turning to the gender policies, we see a stark contrast between former President Trump and Vice President Harris's stances. Harris has been an advocate for women's reproductive rights, supporting federal standards for abortion and protections under Roe versus Wade. Her administration would likely restore these protections, enhancing healthcare for women across the United States. Trump's stance differs markedly. He favors allowing states to decide on abortion restrictions, reflecting a decentralized approach. His policies would restrict funding to clinics referring for abortion services, thus limiting certain reproductive services for women. Furthermore, while the Biden-Harris administration reversed many of Trump's restrictions on contraception and reproductive health funding, Project 2025, a conservative platform aligned with Trump's policies, proposes restoring these limits. Such policies would shift family planning funds towards fertility awareness methods, with limited support for contraception and IVF services, impacting women's health choices. As a scholar focused on African-American women state judges, understanding their political behavior, political representation, challenges they face, as well as strategies that they use to win elections, I see judicial appointments as one of the most enduring influences of a presidency. One of the most enduring impacts, So Biden's administration has set and historic records for judicial diversity. For example, he appointed Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was a landmark achievement, not only bringing diversity to the highest court, but also broadening the perspectives in judicial decision-making. Other notable appointments include Judge Dana Douglas, the first Black woman on the Fifth Circuit of Appeals, and Candace Jackson Akiwumi on the Seventh Circuit, as well as other numerous Black and minority judges across federal courts. So in comparison, just to share a bit about former President Trump's appointments with judges, he appointed over 200 federal judges, which was a great amount of judges in comparison to other presidents with 2 terms, as he currently has only been president for 1 term. So he shaped the judiciary with more conservative rulings. His appointments were primarily traditional, often lacking the demographic diversity seen in the current administration. Vice President Harris, as a potential president, would likely extend President Biden's approach, prioritizing diverse representative judicial appointments. Research shows that these diverse benches foster greater public trust and perceived legitimacy in judicial outcomes. So under Harris, we can anticipate a judiciary that reflects the nation's diversity across gender, ethnicity, and professional background. Such representation is essential, as studies suggest it enhances this judicial decision-making by bringing various perspectives to the bench. For the Caribbean and Latin America, a judiciary inclined towards global issues could strengthen the cross-border human rights protections and fairer interpretations of immigration law, which directly impact these regions, and several other of my colleagues spoke about. So, in closing, the United States election holds critical significance for Latin America and the Caribbean. A Trump administration would likely heighten nationalistic and trade protective measures, potentially straining regional economies and diplomatic ties. Harris, with Caribbean roots and commitment to multilateralism, offers hope for renewed regional engagement and cooperation. As a longtime government worker and policy advocate, I'm encouraged to see these discussions on gender health and the judiciary, all of which shape not only our immediate futures, but also the foundations of justice and equality. Thank you again for the chance to share my perspective, and I look forward to the continued dialogue and the discussion.
All right, thank you, Mea. So I think we have time, maybe, so I'll ask the first question and see where we end up. And wanted to launch on the background of VP Harris. And so it's been mentioned she is of Jamaican heritage. Do we see that as a major influencer in the way that she will engage with the region? And I ask this to contrast with the question I raised with Dr. Quashie earlier in terms of the way that Trump engages with us, because she has been in the region in her capacity as VP, most recently at the 2023 Heads of Government meeting for CARICOM. So is there any positive dimension to her being of Jamaican parentage? Do we see this influencing at all the way she will engage with the region?
I think there's some leverage that, that's there regarding her roots, and, enhancing the U.S. Caribbean relations. As I said, as Professor Bosworth was speaking about, regarding things like climate change, where she differs with President Trump, sustainable development, and hopefully in areas like, education as well. But as Professor Bosworth also added, I don't think that it's going to impact as greatly as we would hope and as we would like. So, it is great that she definitely shares that heritage, but I'm not sure how we'll see this translating regarding policies.
All right, thank you. So I'm gonna throw out another question, but this can be for everyone. So I'm just allowing persons to start posting their questions in the chat because the chat feature is now enabled. So you can go ahead. So I'm gonna pick up on this issue of climate change, which is central to our existence. And we know that in the past, Trump has been classified as a climate denier. And I'm sorry, just trying to find my notes. Right, so one scholar from the Shidra Ramphal Center in Cave Hill actually pinpoints climate change as one of those central dividing features of both individuals. So if each of you could maybe respond on why you see this as a dividing line. So why is climate change a dividing line between Harris and Trump? And if you could just elaborate further on the implications for the region, for this division. We can start with, Mea is spotlighted, so she's on the floor, but I see her shaking her head. So let's go to Quashie, and then we'll circle around.
Hello again, my mic is on, right? Yes, so for me, climate change, I must admit, even though I live in the region, is not my strong suit in terms of academic scholarship. But given that I am someone who is from SIDS, born and live in a SIDS. It is something that is definitely important to me as well, because it affects my life and livelihood. Given the destruction that Hurricane Beryl have left in her wake, particularly on the island, on the Grenadines island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So for me, I see Harris presidency being one who will more engage on the issue of climate change as opposed to a Trump presidency, as you have also noted. He is also deemed someone who denies climate change even exists as well. And to go to Barbados, I wanted to highlight the Bridgetown initiative, to which Barbados have also proposed in terms of urging the international realm to also invest, or the international community to also invest more in climate change. I think in the Bridgetown initiative, it has proposed roughly about 100 million US in terms of the type of investments we need, or the type of funding we need in order to effectively combat climate change as well. So I think either president, I think probably Harris is more likely to look at that initiative as opposed to Trump, as Professor Bosworth also noted. Trump is somebody who takes a unilateral approach. He don't really like to read. So I don't think he will be looking at that initiative at all. But I think for either president, I think taking that Bridgetown initiative into consideration in how they approach climate change related matters within the region is an important step.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Who is going to, Mea, you wanted to go ahead? Okay, all right.
Yes. Thank you for your comment. And I'm gonna go ahead and say as well with Dr. Quashie, I'm not a climate change expert. However, I did a quick Google while he was talking, and so I do have some key points. So we know that former President Donald Trump has called climate change a hoax. He doesn't really believe in it. While Vice President Harris calls climate change an existential threat. And she says that the US needs to urgently act to address it. So as a presidential candidate in 2019, she released a $10 trillion climate plan that calls for investing in renewable energy, holding polluters accountable, and helping communities affected by climate change by protecting natural resources. Additionally, as a California Attorney General, she prosecuted oil companies for environmental violations. As vice president, it was a tie-breaking vote in the Senate for the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided about $370 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below their 2005 levels by the end of this decade. So those are just some of the ways that she's already contributed to climate change and to this discussion globally, and with a focus on the US. So I do think that I have much more faith that with the Vice President and hopefully future President Harris, that we'll have a greater future regarding climate change and cooperation with other countries.
Okay, so I'll allow Prof. Byron to go because she has her hand raised, and then if Dr. Bosworth has any comments, then we can take him after. You're muted, Prof.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think that it's pretty obvious that presidential candidate Harris would be would be better disposed towards providing support for measures to combat climate change. Not necessarily in the sense of in the bilateral sense, but there are major initiatives, as all of you would know, in multilateral spaces. There is the Loss and Damage Fund, which has actually been agreed on and which is a major victory, seen as a major victory by small island developing states. Now, this is a multilateral facility. It would be funded by countries across the spectrum. But of course, support from the United States, even vocally, plays a major role. It is difficult to see Trump presidency paying much attention to initiatives like that one, whereas I think in the case of a Harris presidency, an initiative like that would have a better chance. Now, small island developing states from the Caribbean are looking in all sorts of places for funding for energy transitions. And somewhat ironically, some of the funding comes from the Gulf states, from major oil producers who want to do two things. They want to offset their own carbon impact, their own carbon footprint. And also they know that over the long term, they have to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels as their source of wealth. So they are, in fact, funding a number of initiatives in solar power, in maybe geothermal power and so on in the Caribbean. Now, with the United States, the Biden-Harris administration had a positive approach to funding what it calls clean energy. But clean energy is not renewable energy. Clean energy is dependence on natural gas imported from the United States to fund less damaging fossil fuels. And there was a remark made about US development funding. United States for the last couple of decades has not provided much, significant amounts of development funding, concessionary development assistance to most of our Caribbean countries. We are above the income limit. What they have done is direct us to the development banks, to the Inter-American Development Bank, and to the World Bank and so on. And they facilitate providing us with clean energy technology and so on via funding from the development banks. Now, that has actually provided a huge opportunity for China. And China has been very much involved. If you look at Barbados's electric buses, those electric buses came from China and they were financed by loans from China. And so there has been a lot of momentum for China to step into funding gap because, well, much of the funding on climate change has come either from the European Union or from people like China or from other southern collaborators. But a lot of trade between the United States and the Caribbean and a lot of US investment in industrial sectors in the Caribbean is precisely in the area of energy. It's in Guyana, it is in Suriname, and it is in the area of fossil fuels. It is very important, it's lucrative, but it is not going to help this region to evolve beyond fossil fuels and dependence on carbon generating sources of energy. And it is important for us to remember that. I think that that interest, well, it's going to continue whoever becomes president, but it will be enhanced considerably if we have a Trump presidency. I don't think there's much interest in climate change initiatives or in mitigation initiatives from the United States under a Trump presidency. So I just wanted to say that. I think it's important. Another thing is I wanted to make one comment on the area of trade. In 2020, the United States had a $6 billion trade surplus, merchandise trade surplus with the Caribbean. Okay, so our trade with the United States is very important. But the only country in CARICOM that has had a trade surplus with the United States in recent years has been Trinidad. And the first thing the Trump administration did when it came into power last time around is that they approached Trinidad to negotiate with Trinidad to reduce some of the benefits that it had received so that they could turn around Trinidad's trade surplus with the United States. You know, so we need to remember these things and how far they can go. I think on the question of President Harris, I think she would be more sensitive. She would be sensitive to issues in the Caribbean, given her background, but she will be equally sensitive to issues in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean Pacific region. And because of the relationship with China, a lot of her foreign policy attention is going to be directed towards that region. She also has a heritage from that region, which would serve her in good stead. So just a few thoughts.
Yeah, a lot to unpack because when you mentioned the IDB, I was remembering that there was a big kerfuffle about Trump's appointee to the IDB, and so the institutions are not politically neutral, and we see the politics playing out there as well. But you've also raised this question of China, which we want to come back to. But I'll allow Dr. Bosworth to say to provide remarks if he wants to on this issue of climate change, and then we can come back to China. And maybe we can round out the conversation about trade, which emerged from Professor Byron's comments, because there is a question about inflation in the chat. So, Dr. Bosworth?
Well, I do want to quickly comment. I really like Professor Byron's comment about Trump really does see the Caribbean in terms of what's the import-export balance with the U.S. And if a country buys more from the U.S. than the U.S. imports from it, in his view, that must be good, and he'd like to make it better. And targeting Trinidad and Tobago because it was an outlier country certainly makes sense for him. I think as far as climate change goes, I think the comment I would make here is that I think it's important to understand that the issue of climate change in the U.S. is a little different than it is in most other countries, in that it has become a polarizing and political issue that, while in general, Republicans being more conservative would prefer to not use government or use government as little as possible for regulation or taxes and spending or whatever the case may be. Whereas Democrats have less of a problem with using government trying to solve problems. And this, I think, over time, and this isn't just a Trump thing, this goes back in the Republican Party far more, that if one accepts climate change is occurring, especially if it's occurring due to human activity, it sort of implies pretty strongly that we need to do something about it. And then doing something about it has to be led by government. And Republicans really have a difficult time with that. So their strategy, in part, has been to undermine the notion that climate change is even happening. So if you look at, say, survey research across countries, you'll see less support for the concept of climate change in the US than you would see, certainly compared to European countries and Caribbean countries very directly. I think there's just greater buy-in that it's a problem. And in this sort of polarized environment, I guess just give me an example of what I mean by American polarization is new. I didn't grow up in a country that was deeply polarized, although I was not, and really still am not, a Democrat or Republican. I always thought both sides in their own way had the best interests of the US at heart, that people who were partisan on one side typically recognized the other side as the opposition. These days, about 2/3 of Republicans regard Democrats as the enemy, not just the opposition. And almost 2/3 of Democrats regard Republicans as the enemy, not the opposition. And that has made it very difficult in the US in the last probably decade or so or more to even have a rational conversation about key issues. And climate change, I think, has been a real victim of that. So for Trump, he's kind of playing to his base in a sense by refusing to acknowledge that it happens, by refusing to take any concrete action, and certainly not using government to do anything about it. And Harris, being a Democrat, is in the opposite position where to play to her base, she has to show that she's going to try and make a difference on climate change and that even using government to do so. And that's both domestically and internationally, right? Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords, and he's rather famously sort of denied that there's even a problem, or tried to turn it. He made some comment recently about, well, if the ocean level rises, we'll have more beachfront. It's a little mysterious what he means by that, because current beachfront would be underwater, but that's Trump for you. So I think there's a very different approach, but it's a difficult issue in the U.S. Although it is also true, I think the heartening part is that there are significant majorities of Americans on both sides or across the board that think we ought to do something. Right, there is greater support today for doing something about climate change than there was 10 years ago. I think that will probably continue to progress no matter who is president, but it would probably progress a little faster under a Harris administration and a bit slower under a Trump administration. But I mean, ultimately, as we gather more and more evidence and understanding about climate change, it's harder and harder for people to deny that it's happening or that it's a problem.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bosworth. I'm going to hand over to Ms. Boykins. There is an important campaign rally that's taking place that she has to attend, so she's going to just say some concluding remarks before she departs.
Thank you, everyone, again, for this opportunity and very engaging discussion. As you know, the election is just days away. I'm extremely stressed, so I've got to get back to work. But I really did enjoy this conversation. It was nice to kind of step away from the madness. So if you have any questions specifically for me, please share them with the moderator and I'll certainly address them. Thank you so much again.
All right, thank you, Mea. Bye. All right, so we're still on. There are a few questions. Are you hearing me? All right, so there are a few questions that we need to tackle. So we want to get back to China and the US engagement in the region in light of China's ascendance. So you can just raise your hand if you wish to speak, and then I'll take it in the order in which the hands appear. We do have a question on inflation, as I mentioned earlier. So we want to get to that. And then I would like to ask a question related to migration. So we'll take Prof. Byron.
Yes, thank you. China. Certainly, our current interest for the United States has a lot to do with the fact that China is very present in the Caribbean, and that, well, not just in the Caribbean and Latin America, it's a Latin American and Caribbean issue, and that China has made great strides in terms of being able to do lucrative deals, particularly in extractive industries, in strategic minerals for all the new industries, all the digital industries. Much of that, there are Latin American sources for these minerals. And China is also most advanced in terms of electric transport, electric cars, and it's ahead of the US in that respect. And it has a growing number. In the last few years, more and more countries in the Caribbean, smaller countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America, have broken off their ties with Taiwan and have opened diplomatic relations with People's Republic of China. There are still some, particularly in the Caribbean, including my own country, that have strong ties with Taiwan. But the majority of CARICOM countries and other countries, Panama, Dominican Republic, all these countries opened diplomatic relations with China, to the consternation of both Taiwan and United States over the last few years. Panama got a warm time because of its strategic and its geopolitical significance, as you can imagine. This is not necessarily a bad thing for the Caribbean. It is important to be diplomatically significant. It means that you have to exercise much more agile diplomacy. And you've got to be very energetic. And it also means that if you're dealing with new partners, that you've got to learn as much as you can about them. But I don't think it is something to be scared of, that the United States is disturbed because Caribbean countries have broadened their diplomatic relations. We are players in the international community. When you're small, you have to be agile in building your relationships and in looking for resources. The Caribbean has an interest not in maintaining a frozen world order, but in broadening and helping the world order to evolve in a way that is positive to countries, to southern countries, and to smaller countries with interests in social and economic development, and in having I think we want a world order that is governed by rules, by clear, just rules, as just as possible. Nothing is completely just, but that gives us some predictability in our diplomatic relations with others. So yes, the US is more interested in us because of the Chinese presence, and it is something that we need to work with and to use to the best advantage we can. There was one thing before I stop talking. The first Trump administration had a very chaotic diplomatic presence, probably globally, certainly in the Caribbean. And I think there were many countries where there were many diplomatic posts where there were no US ambassadors for about half of the presidency. It took a very long time. And that, of course, made engaging with the United States a bit more difficult. I mean, you had other people, but there's no ambassador. And ambassadors did not arrive until to the middle or towards the latter part of the term. And I remember speaking with a few Caribbean diplomats, and they mentioned that it was very important to be able to engage with Congress, with congressional caucuses and so on, in order to understand US policy, to understand the dynamics of policymaking, and to have channels of communication with the United States. So the US Congress, both branches, are another important resource for the Caribbean, particularly in times of shifting of change. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Byron. Any additional thoughts, Dr. Bosworth or Dr. Quashie? Okay, I'll take Dr. Bosworth first. You can go after.
Yep.
Go ahead, Dr. Quashie.
Okay, all right, sorry. Yes, I didn't see the hand, but I just wanted to add real quick to the riveting discussion that Professor Byron have also already added on the topic as it relates to trade and also and also as it relates to China presence in the region as well. I just also wanted to mention as it relates to Trinidad and also the fact that they had run a trade surplus with the United States being sort of an outlier. I think it had to also do, again, within the context of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, it had to also do with the fact that they were exporting a lot of ethanol and also oil-based products to the United States as well. So they had an edge over other CBI states that don't have that sort of petroleum advantage. But switching over to the China part as well, I think you guys can also recall, because we would have all been born around that time, when Barack had actually visited Jamaica, and he visited the University of the West Indies. It was an exciting time for me because I was an undergraduate student at that time in the Department of Government. So I was also one of the persons who was also placed on the stage. So I got the chance to shake Obama's hand. And I remember when he came, the concern was that he came because there was a concern with China's deepening relations with the region. I think at that time, China had helped Jamaica to build its four-way lane highway that it have now. Forgive me if I kind of misspoke a little bit. Yes, but I remember that they had invested quite a lot too. I think it was roughly around $600 million it cost as well. And Professor Byron had also touched on the fact that China will also be able to benefit from a lot of the minerals here, et cetera, and stuff. But also, interestingly, they are also going to benefit from the tourism industry as well. Because one of the concerns that was also raised is that the highway that they built here will also see a lot of hotels and restaurants being built, to which China will also be able to benefit and capitalize on our vibrant and rich tourism industry as well. On that note, I also like to mention that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where I am from, we do not have relations with China at all. Our relations, in fact, have been widening and deepening with Taiwan because they have invested a considerable amount of finance in education and also healthcare as well. We have seen it in terms of a lot of the clinics that we built around the throughout the state, and also investment in education in terms of scholarships. But also recently, Taiwan has agreed to fund our acute hospital as well. And I think we have the groundbreaking ceremony this week because the Foreign Affairs Minister from Taiwan is now in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So this is also more evidence of our deepening relations with Taiwan. And I think the United States would not be so concerned with St. Vincent and the Grenadines, given that we are one of the very few Caribbean states that don't have any relations with China at all. So I just wanted to add in those points as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Quashie. Maybe just to mention before Dr. Bosworth intervenes. So when Barack Obama did visit Jamaica in 2015, almost the same date that Ronald Reagan visited in 1982. So Ronald Reagan visited April 7th to 8th, and Barack Obama came April 8th and 9th, but 33 years had passed. That's a significant gap before any US president touched the soil of our region. And I think before Reagan came, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Bernal had indicated that I think 40 years had passed before the previous president had visited and Reagan's visit. So the waters have to be troubled a little bit for them to pay us any attention. Let me hear what Dr. Bosworth has to say on this.
Yeah, I think China in the Western Hemisphere, not just the Caribbean or Caribbean broadly speaking, does pose a challenge for the United States, and I think that's part of the intention. I think one of the goals of Chinese policy there is, not only would China like to import more raw materials and export more products for purchase in the Western Hemisphere, but they see those kind of relationships as something that weakens the U.S., it undermines the U.S., it makes China more of a player. But as Dr. Quashie pointed out, I think an interesting dimension to this agenda is the issue of Taiwan. And the Chinese strategy with Taiwan, I guess, and to put it a little bit crassly, has been to try to purchase the support of some countries. The case of Belize has had a long-standing relationship with Taiwan, and they have been approached more than once by the Chinese, mainland China, saying, "Hey, if you dump your relationship with Taiwan and have one with us instead, we're going to provide a lot of development money. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. But of course, you'd have to support our one China perspective of the world." And I think in the case of Belize, being a pretty small country, it's not exactly able to take on China in some ways. But they rejected China's offer. I think it was a couple of years ago, was the last time that they had made it. And on the one hand, I think there's a legitimate concern that if you accept Chinese development money, you're often accepting a lot of that money is going to be spent on, say, Chinese architects and Chinese managers, and in some cases, Chinese workers. And Taiwan, at least in Belize, has countered that a little bit by trying to be much more visible with their import-export relationship with Belize. Belizean hot sauce is available in Taiwan. Taiwanese products are available in Belize. But Taiwan also very publicly invests in agricultural research. They have an agricultural station. They put a big billboard by the highway for everybody to see. And implicitly, it kind of says, look at how we're investing in your country to try to maintain public support. And more recently, the Taiwanese government has been funding a major highway construction or highway improvement project in northern Belize. It's one of the few very well-funded infrastructure projects. It's put a lot of local Belizeans to work. I know a couple of people who were in the tourist industry and left to be truck drivers because they could make more money driving a truck than they could in the tourist industry in Belize. So Taiwan has become conscious about trying to shore up its remaining support. And the Caribbean is an interesting locus of that. Belize is I guess the way this is expressed in each Caribbean country is a little bit unique based on its circumstances. But I think the Taiwanese agenda or the One China agenda of China is sort of a dimension of this relationship to sort of be considered. I think it's rather interesting.
Okay, I think Prof. Byron wants to come in again. I think we're okay for time. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 more questions if nobody has to leave. So you wanted to come in, Prof. You're muted.
Always do that. Have you been getting many questions from the audience?
I have 2 that came in from the audience, and I would like to pose one, but
Okay.
I'll give the audience the preference for their
Okay.
questions.
Just 2 things. Well, I was going to refer to the same Taiwan-China dimension. My country also has relations with Taiwan. I think it is important that countries in the Caribbean not only make the most of these relationships and so on, but that we also try to understand the dynamics behind the history of the 2 countries, and that we fully understand what the issues are and how we develop our foreign policy positions if ever there is a crisis in relations between China and Taiwan and the United States. It is important for us to be as knowledgeable as we can be concerning these issues. It might seem very far away, but it can become very close at hand. Similarly, the Middle East might seem very far away, but this leads me to another question. When I was speaking about the Eastern Caribbean and CBI, I was not speaking about the Caribbean Basin Initiative. I was referring to the Citizenship by Investment program that some countries in the Eastern Caribbean maintain. These are lucrative, but of course not risk-free strategies for development funding. And one of the most important countries, there are a number of countries that engage with the Caribbean on CBI policies, largely the European Union and the United States. And the United States has been a major interlocutor with countries. The only OECS country that does not have CBI is, of course, St. Vincent. And St. Vincent's position has been made very clear. But the others do. And the United States has been very watchful. US governments, particularly the present one, very watchful in engaging with the countries that have CBI programs and in exerting a bit of pressure and persuasion to adhere to very strict compliance regulations concerning the types of candidates and the types of investment flows that are approved under this scheme. And that is an important area of engagement between the United States and some Caribbean countries. I suspect that a Harris government would be much more focused on the legal compliance aspects of it.
Okay, I think we've actually seen some effects of that pressure because a few countries have increased the cost
in recent, yes.
really the threshold. So it does have an effect, as you mentioned. As you mentioned, the Middle East, let me ask the question that was posed there then. From Dr. Patricia Northover, it says, given the instability in the Middle East, will the Caribbean become a central magnet for geopolitical interests in light of the major oil reserves located in Latin America and the Caribbean? And if so, would this encourage a rethinking by the US if there is a Harris administration of the importance of the Caribbean and lend support to the strident Caribbean calls for development, justice, and new financial architecture? So, a complicated question, but I think we can see where the thought behind it. So anyone wants to take that can, as I said, raise your hand so I can see who would like to address that. Okay, you can go ahead, Prof. Byron.
Well, I think that it would not be the whole Caribbean. It would certainly be the Southern Caribbean. The Caribbean's petroleum reserves are centered in Guyana, in Suriname, to some extent in Trinidad, and of course, Venezuela. I mean, the Biden administration removed sanctions selectively against Venezuela so that US companies could, Chevron in particular, could engage in oil extraction and trade because of the crisis that had arisen with Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. Russian oil was not available because of sanctions. And so Venezuela became geopolitically much more important, geoeconomically, one should say, and Biden administration resumed trade with Venezuela because of the question of oil reserves. So I think it's a relevant question. I think it relates, though, not to the entire Caribbean, but to the Southern Caribbean, where fossil fuel reserves are important and where there are major, Guyana. Guyana is the jewel in the crown at the moment, as far as the United States and major oil investors are concerned. But I think that there are huge energy resources that are exploitable in the Caribbean. They are geothermal resources, they are solar resources, they are wind resources, and it is up to us, if we understand our own interests, to get the investment and to develop the infrastructure and the expertise, the people expertise, so that we can make ourselves much more independent of fossil fuels. That's just my thinking.
Okay, any additional thoughts on that?
I don't know how to work the hand function button. So I'm just gonna chime in real quickly if I can. Yes, I just wanted to add to what Professor Byron has said. I 100% agree with her. And as somebody who was a student during her time I learned quite a lot from her as well. So yes, so the issue I believe is as she had said, would be more in the southern part. But I just only wanted to sort of add that there's also a slight intersection as well, given the Petro-Caribbean initiative that was also implemented by Venezuela as well. So Petro-Caribbean states, those who benefit from the Petro-Caribbean deal may in one way or the other be impacted by any sort of implications that U.S. relations with Venezuela as it relates to the oil may also have as well. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is also one of those states that benefits from the Petro-Caribbean initiative. In fact, Venezuela had actually forgiven written off 100% of what we owe to Petro-Caribbean. I think it's roughly 189 million EC dollars. I don't know the equivalent to the US right now, but I have to quote it in EC. But our EC is actually pegged to the United States dollar at 2.70. So we could kind of work that out. Yes, but the Prime Minister had said that Venezuela had forgiven 100% of the Petro-Caribbean benefits that we were getting from Venezuela as well. I also saw my Prime Minister, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, I'm sorry, I got to talk about home a lot, had also initiated what was called the Argyle Summit, which was because it was held at the Argyle International Airport. And that was the summit between Guyana and Venezuela. But you also had a lot of other Caribbean heads and Latin America as well. I think Brazil, you can't remember. Forgive me if I'm a little bit off here. I might have been present, but it was mainly Caribbean heads who were present. And it was sort of a summit to sort of reduce the tension between Venezuela and Guyana at the time over a particular territory that is also oil rich and has kind of been in dispute, in terms of international law. But we don't really have the time for me to go through the history and all of that. But yes, so I say all of this to add context to the point that, yes, issues within the Middle East, but also particularly as it relates to oil and how Venezuela and Guyana can also, in one way or the other, impact other Caribbean states, particularly St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who benefit from like the Petro-Caribbean deal, etc. and so on.
So I think what your points are underscoring is, so within the basin, there is difference in perspective and approaches, and also different issues affecting the countries that may be points of division. I think that has kind of been underlying some of the comments that were made. I'm going to ask another question that had been posed earlier. Dr. Bosworth, did you want to say anything, or should we go to the question?
I guess I would just sort of quickly add that for the oil producing or potential oil and natural gas producing countries in the Caribbean, the U.S. has become the largest producer of fossil fuels in the world, which is a fairly recent, development. Trump likes that, and Trump doesn't like OPEC. So as long as Caribbean producers don't undermine U.S. markets, that they don't lower the price for U.S. producers, I mean, Trump has a difficult tightrope to walk in the sense that for fossil fuel producing companies in the U.S., a higher oil price is good for their profits. On the other hand, a lower oil price is good for American consumers and gasoline prices. But Trump or Harris would not be very happy about Caribbean producers aligning with OPEC in some of these sort of deals. I think sort of as long as they stay under the radar, they would not earn the hostility of the Trump administration. But he would look at things, I think, transactionally. But
Okay, so we're still on trade.
No Caribbean country has ever become a member of OPEC.
Mhm. Okay, we're still on trade, but shifting a little bit to like broader macroeconomic issues. So there was a question that was posed that says that one of the biggest issues the region faces is the matter of imported inflation. Much of the products the region imports are from the US, which has suffered from high inflationary costs, particularly during the Biden administration. Many have attributed Biden's macroeconomic policies, such as energy policies and other policies that have ballooned the debt and deficit, which weakens the dollar and thus increases inflationary costs. So this question is about Trump now. So would a reversal of these policies under Trump not be beneficial for the region regarding its imported inflation? Any takers for this one? Okay, go ahead, Dr. Bosworth.
well, I think well, first of all, sorry about the inflation. I think that kind of was our fault in the U.S. Although I think one of the reasons that the U.S. experienced some high inflation at the beginning of the Biden administration was that Trump had negotiated an oil production cut with Russia and with Saudi Arabia, and they put that into a 2-year deal towards the end of COVID, right? Towards the end of his presidency. We were, I don't know, halfway through the COVID crisis, I guess, at that point. And demand had gone way down globally in terms of need for oil. So production cuts certainly made sense. But he navigated a 10% cut for 2 years for those countries. So as the global economy came back out of COVID and oil demand came back up, the production wasn't there. And that drove up global oil prices, and that drove up US gasoline prices, US oil prices as well. And that was at least a component of the inflationary pressures the US experienced. In fact, we can even mark in 2022, when that agreement ended, you see a shift in production, a decline in price, and inflation actually declined. The rate of inflation declined in the US. I think what I would be concerned with in terms of American exports of inflation, it's probably less at this point to do with oil and gas prices, and it's probably less to do with both the Trump administration and the Biden administration spent a lot of money dealing with COVID, and then Biden spent some more money just to make sure, and that put way too much money out there, and that contributed to inflation. Neither President Harris nor Trump would be in a position to spend a lot of US money, so that part might be better. But this is where I think Trump's pushing of the tariff policy raises some pretty serious risks. Most economists, I mean, by far, most economists would note that depending on how big the tariff is and things like that, but it would have inflationary pressures on US products. And a lot of products, of course, are made with pieces from all over the world, and they're changed in one place and then re-exported and stuff. So even when we talk about American exports to the Caribbean, those are not necessarily products that are only affected by the US market. Those prices are likely to go up. If they're behind a tariff wall, US producers can increase prices because they can. And if they're dependent on any components that are imported, they're going to have to pay a higher price, and they're going to be forced to raise prices for exports. So I'd be a little concerned that the inflationary pressures are greater, I think, under a Trump administration just because of the tariff policy than it would be under a Harris administration. But my caveat is I'm not an economist, and I would defer to professional economists on that particular aspect.
Alrighty. So I'm going to ask another question. We're changing gears a bit, moving towards my area of specialization. So maybe just a few quick comments, and then I'll take the question that was posed on farm workers. So one of the policy interventions that was mentioned by Ambassador Sanders was Trump's targeting of Cuba. Specifically, the emphasis on the medical brigades from Cuba and tying that to human trafficking, and that having ripple effects in the region because a lot of the countries do rely on these medical assistance teams coming from Cuba. So that's one issue. The other issue is maybe an apparent difference between the Trump or potentially Trump and Harris with respect to an open versus a closed migration regime. But the question that was posed on YouTube, sorry, this is by Dr. Leafton. She asks, what's the likely impact of US elections on migrant farm worker programs? Many fruit and vegetable farmers in the USA depend on seasonal migrant farm workers. I would also probably add, given the comments that were made earlier about reducing legal migration potentially under Trump, is the teacher and nurse migration, because that's one of the larger outputs for the region in terms of exportation of labor. So do you see any difference in administration with respect to the management of migration, specifically with respect to the farm workers, and then maybe nurses and teachers, as I mentioned?
Let me say, Natalie, I'm not an expert on migration, but I would expect that if we have a Trump presidency, that all of these avenues for seasonal migration and others are going to be reduced. We don't know how permanent that would be, but I would expect them to be reduced. I recall that in the last Trump administration, one of the things that happened too is that for people who study in the United States, then I think you have a certain period of time during which if you get a long-term contract, you can get a visa to remain and work for a while and so on. And the amount of time that you had for young people coming out of university, the amount of time you had in which you could get work and apply for this visa was dramatically reduced. I would expect that something like that would happen. That would be a continuation of policy under this Trump administration also. With respect to what was said about Cuban health workers, I do not think that, yes, the US tried this, the Trump administration tried to brand them as being trafficked. I don't think it had an impact on Caribbean engagement with Cuban health workers. If anything, the numbers of Cuban doctors and nurses have increased, not decreased. And there was outrage in many countries in the Caribbean. And in fact, well, no, Italy has signed a number of health worker agreements with Cuba, Italy, and France, and others. So I don't think that slogan, that tag stuck. And certainly it has not influenced Caribbean attitudes towards Cuban health workers. But it is dangerous, and I'm sure that it will be replicated and expanded if we have a Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so any thoughts on this from Dr. Quashie? Okay, Dr. Bosworth, you can go ahead.
I think I just sort of quickly comment on the migrant worker aspect. This is where the two candidates are, they're markedly different on immigration, and particularly with undocumented workers. And a significant, I don't know the percentage offhand, but a significant percentage of agricultural workers in the U.S. are undocumented migrants. And they typically suffer from worse working conditions, right? Because they don't have legal protections and much lower wages. So although Trump sometimes claims that people who come in undocumented are taking jobs from Americans, it's not really clear that those jobs would be filled by Americans, right? You don't really hear about an American who lost their job as an agricultural worker to an undocumented worker. But Trump has also put a lot of stock in this notion that he's going to round up 11 million people and ship them home. And if he does that, first of all, I don't think he can, even if he wants to. It's just, as a practical matter, it's a huge, expensive problem, and I don't see how he could pay for it. I don't see how he could do it, but he could make progress on the issue. But if you reduce that labor supply, U.S. agricultural prices are going to go up. Producers are going to be forced to try to attract labor with higher wages and better working conditions. And those costs would get passed on. It would probably dampen the U.S. agricultural sector, and the U.S. would start thinking about importing more agricultural goods as opposed to growing them in the U.S. So I think it gets pretty complicated for Trump pretty quickly if he really truly carries this out or seeks to carry this out. And the stark contrast with Harris is that Harris has voiced support for things like a legal path to citizenship for people who have been in the U.S. a while, even if they're undocumented, but they're hardworking, they're not getting into trouble. There ought to be a path that they can become more legal. And I think the United Farm Workers gave her a formal endorsement, partly because she's advocating greater protections and greater wages for both the documented and undocumented aspects of agricultural work, in the U.S.
All right, thanks very much. So quite a robust discussion, and we've touched on some things we haven't been able to really unpack. But we do thank you for your attention and for the questions that you posed that have kept the conversation going. I am going to just ask if you could allow Prof. Waller to speak. I think he wants to say something very quickly. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to maybe give some concluding remarks and then hand over to Dr. Johnson to give the vote of thanks. Prof. Waller? Okay, his mic is muted. Okay, so we'll just transition to the final remarks. If you have 30 seconds of something burning that you wish to share with us before we go.
Oh, well, no. I just, sorry about that, Natalie. I got kicked off. Now, I just wanted to say that, following on what Jessica said earlier about Bernal's work, with the development of a policy document to guide Caribbean partners with regard to what implications of the regime change would be. I think, Jessica, I'm giving you more work because we may reach out to you to ask you to ask you to formulate. I mean, once the 5th of November is over, well, we don't know. We may have to wait until the end of November. But if in an instance that we are able to know a couple of days following the election, we would love to, engage you to, and of course with other partners as well on the call, to develop a policy paper that SALISES would share with the Caribbean with regard to the implications of the regime change. I truly believe that all of our trading partners, the major ones, especially UK, US, Canada, and EU, once there is a regime change, there should be a deep look at its implications for the Caribbean, or arrangements or modalities or processes or futures, so we can adjust accordingly and try to pivot to the changes that occur. So we're going to engage you in that regard, Professor Byron, just to let you know, and you will, and to lead this initiative, and you can identify your team, which I'm sure will be everyone on this panel discussion, to help in formulating this policy document. So, and I'm saying thank you very much for offering. I see you saying yes. The look in your eyes is basically saying yes. So thank you very much for taking up the offer, Professor Byron.
I suspect Professor Waller needs new glasses. Take it on advisement, and we'll discuss it further.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
All righty. So any concluding thoughts? I saw that, so I guess if we were Trump supporters, we'd have MAGA on our shirts. I saw that Harris had Pretty People for Harris or something like that going around. But do we want, obviously, I don't think we want MAGA, but it seems like from the comments that the Harris administration would be more beneficial to the region because of the multilateral approach and the emphasis on the core issues that are of significance to the region. I don't know if I'm reading that correctly. That's my concluding thought. So I'll allow you 30 seconds to say what your own view is, and then we'll hand over to Dr. Johnson.
Okay. Yes, I agree with what you just said, Dr. Dietrich Jones. Yes, a Harris administration would probably be more in line with Caribbean interests. Of course, we do not know that we're going to get a Harris administration, and it is equally as likely that we will have another Trump administration, and therefore there needs to be quite a lot of work, quite a lot of preparatory work, and quite a lot of looking back and looking at. I think Dr. Bosworth gave us some very useful insights into some of the recent initiatives and proposals that have been mentioned by the candidates. If the next Trump administration is anything like the last one, it may be a bit different. Things will change. You announced that you're going to have a 10% tariff placed on all imports into the United States across the board. Now, once that is, it may change quite a bit, but you do know that there's a tendency towards increased tariffs and so on. It just means that there's a lot of preparatory strategic work to be done on many fronts. I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure discussing with the rest of the panel and also listening to the questions and concerns from the audience. Thanks, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you, Prof. Byron. It was a pleasure having you. Over to you, Dr. Bosworth.
Well, I have to actually vote in this election next week. I guess I think this election is so close. I don't really have a prediction for the outcome in terms of the winner versus the loser, but I do think it's going to be very messy. I would expect a number of legal challenges. It very much pains me to say that I would not rule out at least isolated instances of violence on election day, probably not on election day, but in the immediate aftermath, I think you're more likely to get problems. And how that gets resolved, hopefully legally and peacefully, we'll see. But that may lead to a Trump administration. And if it does, I don't have enough money to do citizenship by investment in the Caribbean. But if any Caribbean country needs an American political scientist who's maybe pretty good at drinking rum, I think I might be available pretty soon. I try to visit as often as I can, but I may need to visit longer periods of time for a little while. So it's a little frightening, I think. I have never really questioned the democracy of the United States as much as I have during this election. There's a lot at stake for the United States and its future. And I don't see Trump as being very healthy for democracy in America. Harris is much better in that regard. So as a self-interested American who supports democracy, I think it's pretty clear what side I'm rooting for and things. And I think as far as the Caribbean goes, I agree with it. It's pretty clear contrast between the two in terms of what's likely to be better. But I think either way, the Caribbean's going to have to kind of just do more on its own. There's no rescue package coming from the U.S. no matter what. There's no fundamental change, I think, in things. But
Okay, thanks. And over to you now, Dr. Quashie.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say thank you for also inviting me to speak among such esteemed scholars as well. And as I said before, I was also a student during Professor Jessica Byron. I think she was the head at the time when I came in at the time, and so on. So it is so real to see, you move from student to where you are now. So if any student is listening, I hope they use me as a motivation as well. So just to conclude on the US and the potential implications, I definitely do agree with my colleagues on the panel as well, that Harris presidency is more likely to be better for the region. But also we should, be measured in our expectations as well, because I don't see there is going to be much change. There's not going to be much investments either. So we really have to do this on our own. And just also to add, if we sort of use the Biden administration as a unit of analysis here, we can kind of have a sense of how Harris might approach the region as well. I mean, of course, she can take an entirely different approach. So I'm not saying because she was the VP under Biden, she is more than likely to adapt a lot of Biden's policy. And the reason why I said that, it is because Biden was also Obama's VP, but he sort of shifted a little bit in terms of Obama's policy approach to the region, i.e., given that Obama took Cuba of the U.S. State sponsor of terrorism list, and he actually engaged with Cuba as well. I mean, he couldn't remove the embargo because the embargo is codified within the Helms-Burton Act. So it's not under the executive branch, which meaning the president, but is more the legislative branch, which is Congress, would have to end the U.S. embargo. But the reason why I'm making this point is because we see that Biden took so long to remove Cuba of the state sponsor of terrorism list, even though Trump administration, when he came in, he actually placed Cuba back when he was leaving in 2021. And now recently, earlier this year in 2024, Biden quietly, because it wasn't a major announcement at all, sort of moved Cuba off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. And also, one last point, real quick, is that Biden also was criticized for the recent OAS summit as well for not inviting Cuba and Venezuela. And I think it was also Nicaragua as well, if memory serves me right. So that is sort of not so democratic and the sort of engagement that we got from his former boss, President Obama, when he was VP at the time. So I say all of this to say that if we take the Biden administration as a unit of analysis to sort of kind of have an idea how Harris may engage the region, we have to also do it in circumspect, because this does not mean that she will sort of mimic this, everything that Biden did. She can take a different approach, as Biden have also in some ways taken a different approach to his former boss as well. But all in all, I will say that Harris might be more better for the region. But of course, as Professor Byron and Professor Bosworth have all said earlier, we should take a very measured approach and sort of temper our expectations as well.
Okay, so maybe just to conclude, I'm going to read something from Samantha Chaitram, because she argues that the Caribbean has regained some level of visibility and reappeared on the radar of US policymakers. But the part I'd like to emphasize is what has been said across the board in terms of measured expectations. So she says that on average, roughly the same amount of foreign aid was allocated to the Caribbean under both Republican and Democratic administrations in the 21st century, indicating continuity in policies from the Bush to the Obama administration, because she was looking at 2001 to 2016. So while we have pinpointed some major points of division, there might still largely be a uniform approach to the region. So we wait with bated breath to see what exactly happens after November 5. So I'm going to thank you again, everyone, participants online and our panelists for sharing today, and hand over to Dr. Johnson to move the official vote of time.
Thank you, Chair. Now, as we draw this insightful webinar to a close, I feel honored to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks to everyone who made today's event a success. First and foremost, thank you to our esteemed speakers, Emanuel, Quashie. It was inspiring to witness your journey from an undergraduate student to a distinguished PhD holder. Your insights today, would have shed invaluable light on the intricate dynamics at play. Mea Boykins, I know she went offline. Her expertise and thorough analysis provided us with a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter. A special thank you to Professor Jessica Byron, whose decades of academic excellence continue to enlighten and guide us, even in retirement, which I don't think she's retired. Your perspective enriched our discussions immensely. Dr. Jeffrey Bosworth, as our Honorary Research Fellow, your depth of knowledge and dedication to research have been pivotal in shaping today's dialogue. And to my colleague, Dr. Natalie Dietrich Jones, your collaborative spirit and insightful comments have greatly enhanced the quality of these presentations. I also want to express gratitude to our attentive audience for taking the time out. Your engagement, thoughtful questions, enthusiasm have been the backbone of these webinars, and I would go and declare it a success. It is your participation that truly brings this discussion to life and underscores the importance of our collective exploration of these critical issues. Lastly, thank you to the organizing committee and everyone behind the scenes, Richard, Cara, sorry, I shouldn't start calling name because I'd have to continue, whose hard work and meticulous planning ensured everything ran smoothly.
And
Now,
to MITS and UTV.
you see, together we have navigated the complexities of the US elections and their far-reaching implications for the Caribbean. Now, I'm confident that the knowledge shared today will foster deeper understanding and inspire future collaborations. Thank you once again for your time, dedication, and participation. Safe travels and have a good day.
Thank you.
You.
Good day, everyone. Bye.